This is Graham Scott, and you're listening to the Agile Uprising podcast.
All right, it's another edition of the Agile Uprising podcast. You know who it is. You know what time it is. We're going to go a cold intro this time. I'm going to say thank you to Ben and thank you to Mike, my unindicted co-conspirators who are joining me once again. And speaking of someone joining us once again, we have him back on to talk again about his book, where almost everything has changed. Mr. Jeff Anderson. Jeff, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's awesome.
So we are so glad to have you back. The book we're talking about again is Organizing Towards Agility. And I believe, Ben, was it 2 years ago? 3 years ago we had Jeff on last? I don't remember how long it was.
Yeah, it's COVID time, so it's all warped at this point.
Yeah.
Right. 30
There's a bit of a time dilation. There's a bit of a time dilation effect, right? So
well, excuse me. I guess I'll start off with this, Jeff. So we talked and you were still working out ideas, you were still formulating stuff, and you had, I dare say you were a good 75% of the way done when we last talked to you.
It felt like that, yeah.
And then you went back to the well. You totally went in the kitchen and went off the reservation, and then you're like, oh yeah, I finished the book now, and it's about 80% in a totally different direction. And Ben and I were like, oh, okay. So let's start. Well, before we dive into the context, let's start with the genesis of that, Jeff. Like, what was going on that it made you pivot the window?
Well, being like extremely transparent, I was probably getting a little bit disgruntled with Agile at the time. A lot of us are. There's what you hope is going to happen, and then there's what always happens, or what tends to happen in the clients you're working with, the organizations you're working for. I think sometimes we're too hard on ourselves, and we want more for the people we're trying to help than we get to. And I started, this is a bit of a long story, I'll try to shorten it, but I started going way off the reservation around how can I talk more about progressive organizations. So a lot of the post-agile stuff you'll see in things like reinventing organizations or any of the corporate rebels type work or humanocracy. And I started trying to take it that direction, and didn't take very well. It took me a few months to realize that I didn't really have the credibility to talk about a lot of that stuff as sort of first order concepts. The examples I had weren't really good enough, the experience. But what that did lead me down is how to connect some of the stuff that I was doing with better storytelling, how to connect some of the concepts around humanity and teamwork. My original book was very structural. How do you set up agile operating models? How do you remove barriers, eliminate handoffs? And what I think what I'm hoping is coming out of this version of the book is I spend a lot more time talking about teamwork. And like the kernel of agility isn't the team, it's 2 people or 3 people engaging in teamwork. That's the real kernel. And it's that hyper co-creation and collaboration, and like pair programming is almost the core, and pairing and mobbing and selling and swarming and all these different buzzwords really to say, hey, can we get out of our silo and can we get up and work together on something? So that became kind of the new core of the book. And what I did is I started going through a lot of my experiences, a lot of the theory that I had in the book. And I said, well, let's go and bring some real stories into this. So I went to some of my clients, which very graciously, almost all of them got on board in a public way. So if you're Canadian, you'll be like, oh, this is like a great Canadian agile book because we've got Scotiabank and we've got Shoppers and Loblaws and the Alberta Treasury Bank, and we've got all kinds of, kind of organizations where people will go, hey, I recognize that, eh? I know what that is. And so, but lots of real stories of people being tenacious and scrappy and trying to create environments of agility in organizations that are basically still in the industrial age when it comes to their management. But that's agility for most of us. We've got a team, or we've got a team of teams, or some sort of like maybe a line of business. Maybe the whole organization's doing agile, but it's a very bureaucratic form of scaled agile, and it's very traditional form of agile. But there's always a set of people that are trying to really increase agility, really operate, in a progressive way. So there's a lot of stories in there now. And as the stories started taking shape, the book became more based on how do I tell the story rather than all the methods and practices. Like that's all still there, but I try to really elaborate on things with real people and real experiences.
One of the things and when we talk about book structure, one of the things that stuck out at me when I read it for the second time was the way you built that narrative. Is you start with teams, then you go with the ecosystem of teams, and then you keep building from there and there, and you get bigger and bigger and bigger without explicitly saying, and now we're going to talk about scaling. Your intro, the intro chapters, right? The whole setup and the background and stuff, I really, really love. There was a quote in there that I highlighted, and it's on a post-it over here next to me, where you said, your value network is working in spite of your management structure, not because of it. It is running against the official part of your organization. And that to me was, we've talked about Niels's work before with Open Space Beta, which, he talks about org physics, but that to me, like if I could give one-liner to every leader I'm working with today, it would be that one. We're successful not because of your management. It's because the value delivery people know whom to talk to get the value out the door.
That's absolutely right. And in fact, more and more people are coming along to this type of thinking. John Smart with and co with Safer, Sooner, Happier would be an example of describing this sort of agile change or this new ways of working change. It's less an active definition and more an active discovery. So how is value being created under the radar? Who is talking to who to get things done? If you know what those people are, you can start saying, hey, why don't we put it, even if it's a temporary team, let's put a team around this. Let's put a backlog around it. Let's go kind of, let's articulate what that workflow looks like. And let's continue to kind of explore the organization and make the implicit parts explicit. And that's actually a lot of the job. And that I think is, for me, it's almost like, I describe it as finding those areas where teamwork is working well and illuminating that and trying to emphasize where the teamwork is working well and try to emphasize it and expand it out.
So, Jeff, you made a statement that some people who may be new to this more modern way of thinking might find a bit strange, and you use the term temporary team, and that just kind of leads into the perspective on teams and teaming, and teaming as a verb just really struck out of me. It got me off my duff to actually download and start dynamic reteaming.
Amazing book, by the way.
Just started it the other day. Could you share a bit about that there's sacred cows that get slaughtered in this crowd, and love that. That seems to be getting at a sacred cow. Can you maybe tell the audience a bit about your perspective on teams and teaming and temporary teams and helicopter teams? And
I'll start out by saying I think stable, cross-functional, persistent teams are amazing, and they make, that's the goal because, that is a goal, which is to create a safe space for people to engage in very effective teamwork. And teams are like, having that persistent, I'll call it typical big A agile team is a great way to do that. But now I'm going to counteract what I just said. Teams aren't the goal. Teamwork is. And even if we see any sort of implementation of a team-oriented workforce in any organization, you'll see lots of teamwork happening across and outside the team boundaries. And that's always going to happen because, especially in an environment of uncertainty where things are constantly changing, your team model's always going to be a little bit or a lot wrong. It's impossible to create the ideal team model, and outcomes and demands and market change and things are going to come into your organization, which is going to force you to collaborate across those teams. People used to make a lot of a very big deal about like the product-oriented organization. Oh, we got to organize around products. And everyone's going to organize around products, and that's much better than functions. But then, I don't know, something came along that said we need to go and optimize our onboarding of all products to a digital channel. And we're going to do this across 17 products. And if you get too religious about the big A agile stable team, you're going to allow that initiative or that outcome to go across 17 teams. And then they're all going to have to collaborate with each other on the consistent experience. And they're all going to, have to collaborate on the end-to-end journey. And then each team is going to be really responsible for a bit of like product specific stuff. And none of the stand-ups are going to support that collaboration. None of the cadences, none of the metrics, nothing. So, if you're really following one of the sacred cows, agile teams must be stable. You're going to dramatically reduce agility and dramatically increase bureaucracy and the need for management overhead as you get this work across all these teams. Now, if you bring everybody together into the same team, you do run the risk of instability. And those people will feel less safe to engage in teamwork at first. So you do have to get them into that team and give them enough time to actually learn how to gel with each other. But to me, if you have a big change in outcome, you need a big change in team structure. So like Sacred Cow 1, static team structure doesn't make sense to me. I really like the way, I first saw this in Kanban, by the way, which was the saying, don't let the work travel to the teams, let the workers travel to the work. So it's the opposite. And you use visual management to say, hey, where do our people need to go? And how can those people self-identify where they need to go? And then even if they form into a virtual team for a few weeks and then let the work move on and go back to where they were, as long as they've got a repeatable pattern for doing that, that's as legitimate of a pattern as, the big agile stable team. Like there's lots of these patterns you can use.
I will tell you, when I saw the stable teams, the road agility, I just took a picture of that line that I highlighted, and I got my copy here with all my stupid notes, and I sent it to my I guess my cohort at work at my current job, which is coaches and transformation people and not. And it was like South Park.
Everyone's getting mad, right?
Noise. But when they stopped and they thought about it, it was, oh shit, you know what? You're right. Maybe we are, to your point on getting too high centered on the sacred cow, maybe we are creating fragility by supposedly emphasizing stability. And Ben, Mike, myself, we're big heterodox thinkers. As soon as somebody's saying, 9 out of 10 doctors tell you to use this toothpaste, the three of us are yelling, saying, well, what does that 10th guy know that we don't? Like, no, I want to listen to the 10th guy. And you introduce a lot of these type of things where you challenge the shibboleth, but in a way that makes you think, where you go, yeah, he's probably onto something. We got a little bit too far down the zealot rabbit hole and not the open-minded rabbit hole.
So I want to say I am a fan of stable teams, but there's like a few pragmatic. One of the concepts I have in my book is, and it's not my concept, it's just borrowing Dunbar's numbers. And, the idea that, with 5 people, you can really work together. With 15 people, it's an active, network. And 50, 150, 500, you start getting into culture, identity, affiliation. At least in enterprise settings, I don't know of that many 5 people cross-functional teams that can truly own an outcome. It's just the architecture's not there, the technology's not there, the operations is not embedded. So you end up getting a cast of 15 people in every team, or 20 people in every team, and that's not a team. You can't have a stand-up with 20 people. You can't. So immediately, and this happened when I was over at Scotiabank in a group known as Global Business Payments. We were asked to go help with agile project management. And of course, we're never supposed to do agile project management. But you don't say no when someone asks you to help with something that's a little dysfunctional. You say yes, and by the way, here's what the future looks like. So we helped them with agile project management on this 10-person team. But then that worked so well that the business started saying, well, can you do this other thing for me? And it became a 12-person team, 18, 25-person team. And we're like, this isn't a team anymore. So we had a big Kanban board back when people actually worked in front of each other on a big wall. And we just said, we're going to draw swim lanes in this Kanban board. And we're going to define the left part of the board as being more cross-functional and more the whole team. But typically there'd be some like architects and leaders and that kind of thing. And the right side of the board is going to be more feature-oriented, and they're going to be groups of 8 and 10. And they're going to have their own stand-ups and planning. And so we started creating cadences that were for the team of teams and some visual management for the team of teams. And we started doing the same thing for the team level. And what we noticed is if you're just a little bit practical, you can do a lot of agile scaling by just taking visual management, being a little more bespoke on your cadences, getting an end-to-end flow going, and operating these sort of ecosystems that range anywhere between kind of like 20 on the low side and maybe sort of like 50 would be maybe the upper maximum, at least in my experience, before you start saying we need to break this ecosystem up. So that's your stability is still important, but if you have an organization of 30 to 50 people where that's enough room to have identity still, or a reasonable amount of trust, and half those team members are stable and half of them are floating and moving based on needs, you can start seeing patterns. Of like when this type of complex engagement goes through, we're going to need these 3 legacy folks and this UX person and this, but when that one comes through, we can use these people, and people start actually being able to self-organize, not only around the work, but the sort of the topology, so to speak, of the work itself.
Yeah. And so, Jeff, you touched on something that really resonated for me. That was in the ecosystem portion, where you're talking about social density is the concept that scales, not agile processes.
Yes.
And the idea of containing dependencies within context boundaries. Again, Dunbar numbers, plural. And just the whole idea of market-facing teams and the core and edge, and that just really resonated. I was like, that somebody put into words what I have lived, that kind of made sense. But you took the idea of market-facing teams a little bit further than I think many organizations are initially comfortable with. So I was wondering if you could tell the audience a bit about
Sure, absolutely.
and what makes it so powerful, because I think it's easy to miss that if you're not.
So first of all, I have very few good original ideas. So the idea of this fluidity at the ecosystem level is really because I got really deep into Kanban and saw it as not being about the board, but about this enabler of social dynamics and fluidity of organization. The market-facing teams really came out of Neil Flaglin's Organizing for Complexity, where he literally says, don't draw things as a hierarchy, draw it as a circular value network, where all of what you do is you start with all the market actors and their outcomes, and then you say, okay, what is required to deliver on those market actors and outcomes? And let's just say that's the team. And then what will end up happening is, as you're putting all these sort of people and capabilities into these market-facing teams, you start realizing that not all of this stuff can be in the teams, and you start moving it into the center of the organization, which I call the core. I think he calls it the center. I use the word edge and core to mean like the edge is the market-facing team and the core is the center, just because I do a lot of work in banks and they love that kind of language. So I just kind of took it on. They'll have a lot of things like productize the core and enable the edge, and I'm like, yeah, those are pretty cool sentences. So I'm gonna kind of steal that. But I've never been able to take it to its extreme. But what I have done is I've been able to say, if you were to recast your organization, what would it look like? And then we get sort of a lot of people going, oh, if only. And then what I've been able to done is go into various teams and ecosystems. And if the idea is that you want to have a really good handle or a really solid core, and you want to have really good market, real good precision with the edge, then we're going to describe your team as a knife. And we're going to ask you why why is the edge, or why is the blade dull, and why is the core giving you really poor kind of like a really poor handle? Or why do you have a really poor handle on the core? Sorry, I messed that up a bit. And sort of going through all the barriers, because any agile coach or consultant will probably have had this experience. Either they were on the subjugated end of it, or they were inflicting this on somebody else, where they came in and said, oh, let's measure how agile you are. But since we can't actually measure lead time or customer value, we're going to do this thing where we'll put you through an agile maturity matrix, and we'll sort of like, and I'm guilty of this too. We do it sometimes just because we don't have anything else. And it's all based on skills. It's all like, can you write a story? Can you break it down? Can you? And I said, well, maybe that should be 2 out of the 8 barriers. Like, the capability is important, but how many handoffs between you and your end user? Oh, we got to go to the customer research people that go to the enterprise analytics people that talk to the customer ownership group that gets the feedback from the external marketing group that gives it to the team. Okay, so that's not a very good market-facing team, and that's an extremely imprecise edge. So how can we sharpen that a little bit? And so we start asking about how do we reduce the barriers to market access? And then borrowing an idea from team topologies, how can you improve the enterprise experience? Everyone talks about customer experience. Well, enterprise experience is the experience your teams go through when they deal with enterprise support functions. So let's go talk about enterprise experience. In team topologies, they called it developer, sort of like, or team experience. And I'm like, no, it's not just about the developer, it's the whole team. Yeah. So I decided to call it enterprise experience. And most enterprise experiences are relatively poor. So let's go and assess that instead. So agility assessments have very little to do with team capability. It's still in there, but it's, 2 out of, kind of like a larger pie of things that are much more focused on access to your customers and frequency of customer feedback and, experience when working with the enterprise and the amount of choice and autonomy you have to actually kind of get things done.
You've touched on Kanban and visualization a few times,
yeah,
and how powerful it is, and in many ways, kind of how common sense and simple it can be, right? Like just let's visualize it, let's put it on a picture. And you've got some great visuals in the book. Particularly love the view of the graduated backlog and that whole view of things. Why? Can you talk a little bit about just some of the power that can happen from these visualizations, and B, why is it that particularly bigger, older companies, it's so hard to do something so simple? And the default seems to be more, how do we obfuscate information via PowerPoint rather than let's just get the actual information out there visualized in real time?
I don't think that's a really good question. So first I'll talk to the power. The interesting thing about Kanban systems is you're visualizing how much work is occurring in every state of an imaginary workflow. And the workflow is imagined by the people doing the work. And it's also changed by the people doing the work, which is really powerful because you have this abstract assembly line. And just by visualizing it, you could start asking much more intelligent questions about who is doing what and why there are bottlenecks somewhere, how much risk is in the work. People tend to be very quick to grasp things they can touch and feel and color, and sort of Kanban is deliberately simpler than all the other systems that have been used to date. It's kind of like, I know we don't like Twitter anymore, but like Twitter is Twitter at its best is an effective mechanism because you can only say so much. We now know the problems with that, but Kanban is a bit of a similar situation where it forces you to say less, which makes sure that it's easier for people to get on the same page. And it's extremely powerful because if I know that there are, a whole lot of things in shaping and they're just piling up, but the downstream delivery is not happening and it's not working, I can go to the discovery people can go, what's going on downstream? And they can spontaneously go downstream and start engaging in an active teamwork with the people downstream and say, do you need help? And they can say, yes. Most traditionalists organize around either a project with individualized roles and responsibilities or a department with individualized expertise. And so if I want to add a new type of function or a new type of work, they add a new department or a new team, and it's all siloed. And that's why you end up like large programs will have 27 work streams and 17,000 project managers all coordinating with each other to kind of understand what they're doing. But in the Kanban world, you just say, what is the work? Who do I need to help on it? Let's swarm. And if nothing's working, instead of trying to plan it all out, you just do less at a time until things start to move. So it becomes a much simpler, easier way for people to dynamically engage in these acts of teamwork. People don't gravitate towards it, I think, as much as they could, because they're still coming out of decades of industrial era management training, which says more specificity is good, more planning is good. If I only plan this thing more accurately, it'll be more, it's going to, like, they think predictability is an act of planning. When we say predictability is an act of feedback and learning, and sure, you need to plan, but you're learning, planning, and they'll be like, well, you just didn't define it well up front, so let's just get better discipline and let's just figure it out. And one of the responses I like to say is, I'm going to take 3 babies actually, that's better, and 2 toys, and stick them in a playpen, and I want you to plan exactly what toy is going to go in what baby's hands for how long as an act of, predicting their sharing. And I'm like, it's not going to happen. And it has nothing to do with complication or number of moving parts, or you're people don't realize they're in an emergent domain, or they've been trained not to accept that. And so it's all psychological acceptance, and it's acts of unlearning are more important than the acts of learning, which is, it's a long journey,
Well, it's definitely a learned blinder condition where I got pulled into a conversation and someone said, well, we just need the teams. And this is part of the org that's still doing a waterfall thing. And they said, well, we really need to target for this year. We need to get better at estimating. And I went, well, explain that. And they said, well, our plans always get thrown to the side and there's always stuff that we don't have. And we grossly underestimate the work that needs to be done. So we just need to get better at estimating. And I started laughing and it didn't go over well. When I started laughing, I said, what do you mean you need to get better estimating? I said that you're never going to get better at estimating. I said, too much complexity, too much, it's that commercial where somebody's turning their light switch on and off in their house. They're going, what's this do? And 3 houses down, the garage door is smashing into the lady's car, right? There's too much stuff that we can't predict. We just get better at, okay, well, thinking smaller and managing what you can. And on that note, there was something you brought up in the book, which I thought was really interesting, man. You could have pulled on this thread for like 40, 50 pages. The idea of a micro enterprise, which was Ben and Mike and I have done Peter Merrill's stuff. We love his stuff. He talks a lot about open book management from John Case. So this is Hire. This is Mayakawa. This is Semco. This is that whole idea of setting up a company within a company, which owns it from womb to tomb and works with the customer and a P&L. And that idea, I think, is absolutely brilliant because back to the Dunbar numbers, right? What Ben, Mike, and I come from a company that was 70,000 people. How could you hope how could you remotely hope to effectively manage an organ that size? But you start chunking it out into different almost organs inside of a living body. There I go, Mike, with that analogy again. It's much easier to manage it. And that is something that I think maybe if companies got a little bit more confident, if they tried it, they would see the benefit of
it. The real context boundaries.
Yeah.
What you're talking about, Jay. Yeah. I'm sorry, Jeff. Go ahead.
I was going to say what you're talking about is actually like, it's a much more advanced form of context boundaries or ecosystems. The biggest, I think, roadblock for people, at least in traditional organizations, is you have to give up the idea that that it's okay to have market choice determine the winner outside your organization, but have command and control and central planning work inside your organization. Most organizations I kind of like, this is going to probably offend some people, but our internal kind of little sort of like 1970s era communist fiefdoms, in that you've got one person doing enterprise architecture, one person group doing HR, like all the central support functions are monopolies. And when you've got 88,000 people, that's enough people to have a market. And if you go and be the only person providing a service to 88,000 people or 90,000 people or whatever it is, it's not only unfair to the people using that service, it's unfair to the people providing the service. Because the people providing the service can't prioritize who to service. And they try to do everything and they end up doing a poor job. Like any time you use a monopoly outside in the real world and you get bad service, the people working for the monopoly have just as much of a thankless job as the people getting the service. So organizations like Hire get onto this idea that two teams should only work together, or two ecosystems should only work together if they create a contract. And they say, well, you do this work and I'll pay you this much and I'll do that work. And so at a Hire, HR is a choice. You choose your HR provider. And there's multiple HR providers, or, you want to use these people who are providing some kind of infrastructure, you choose. And all of these kind of, collaborations are an active choice. Amazon has a lesser version of that. You can't prove that you're going to have people using your product, you won't get funding. So even the internal products, you have to prove it based on usage. So there's this notion, like really successful organizations at scale, they have a network, but the network isn't a command and control engineered network. It's a real network. And so choice is being used to determine which of these things succeed and which of these things don't succeed.
I can just hear the people out there screaming, but what about compliance and security and cost efficiencies and economies of scale? And
Yeah.
I'm sure you've encountered that too. I can hear it out in the ether.
But that's what, I mean, this could sound really bad, but that's what communist China says. What's wrong with Canada and the United States and, you know, the Western world? Oh, there's too much choice and there's no safety. And that's all true until the person on the top makes a really bad decision that impacts everybody. And you go from a completely closed society to opening everything up in a matter of 2 weeks. And, you know, you throw the baby out with the bathwater, you know, and that's what you have in some of these more totalitarian organizations is they're really, really good until they're really, 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 really bad. And, you know, and I don't think that works any differently inside of an organization. Regulations, you could have numerous regulatory providers that are competing with each other. And like at Amazon, there's a lot of social peer pressure that if you're not using the established framework, just because you're a renegade, people will go like, but this is good. Why aren't you using it? And the actual social density, but the social density really comes into play and says, what's going on? And I'm not saying Amazon's great in all ways. There's lots of toxic stuff there too. But this idea that social kind of, you know, pressure and, the reasonableness factor can go into a lot of these conversations. So if you're in a highly regulated environment, you might have a number of in-house really good regulatory providers and you choose to go with none of them. Well, you're going to have somebody say to you, well, you know, if you incur the risk, by the way, you own the complete profit and loss of this risk. And if you go under, you're going under on your own and all the people that are under you will no longer have jobs. So, you know,
skin in the game. Yeah. You're forcing them
skin
into
in the game. Yeah. And rather than having the regulatory kind of body, the advisors in your organization be completely responsible for it, they're just there to advise you. And you've got like one of the things that's really neat with these concepts is the team has the P&L. Or the ecosystem has the P&L. And maybe it's virtual. We've done it virtually with some organizations where at least they know their carrying costs. And then they know kind of sort of a model which based on usage, what revenue they're making. And it's not to the complete higher level, but you see a lot better decision making when people can see kind of the inputs and the outputs. And then they have more skin in the game, basically.
It kind of reminds me of a point that you hit on was about autonomy, not independence, and you know, kind of the balance there, which reminded me of something from Xscale, autonomy with alignment, and kind of tangentially there, but it's that really resonated for me.
Yeah, was it the remark about there are no independent teams, but there can be autonomous teams? That was like one of those. But I mean, I want to yes and Jeff's metaphor where if these chunks inside of these organizations are communist fiefdoms, right? Does that mean safe as the Potemkin village? Don't answer that. Ben, what do you got, Ben?
Yeah, I was wondering if you could speak a bit about, it's not necessarily the tool that you use, but also kind of how and the intent with which you use it. You talked about how, for example, if you start using cloud services and those governing it within a company kind of deploy it and control it and kind of mandate it and phase gate it in certain ways, then you're kind of completely missing the benefit of using the cloud. So, and it ends up being a distributed monolith. So could you speak a little bit about that?
Well, first I'll talk about the sort of like the enforced DevOps model, or DevOps as a set of enforced tools. Like when I've got a couple of really good coaches. Ashley and Addison are two people that work at Agile by Design who are working with a senior director in Scotiabank. I'm doing a lot of. I gotta spare some love to some of my other clients in a second. I'll do that. But they were trying to work with a centralized platform as a service. Kind of everyone follow the same tool, the same standard, and this client was doing a lot of very specialized IBM payment gateway, transaction management server type stuff. And the existing tools that were being sort of, enforced by the organization worked great if you were on mobile and web and, had the sort of the classic digital stack, and no way would work with anything that was sort of bespoke, proprietary product, because how could it? It doesn't make any sense. And so what that group did is they had about 12 teams that needed this type of infrastructure. They needed the practices, pipelines, continuous testing. They're starting to really scale, and things were starting to really slow down. And so what that group did is they created this enablement function, which was known as the DevOps enablement function. And what they did is they treated all of the other, 12 teams as their first class customers, and basically said, there's 12 of you. And for now, based on the volume of work you're doing, we're going to take a request from you once a week, you twice a week, and you 3 times a week. They did basically a sharing allocation. And actually, that wasn't needed for long, because very quickly what they found is you need to allocate by the enthusiastic adopters and not worry about. At first, they were trying to limit how much they would get, and then they realized they had the opposite problem. So they started working with the eager adopters, not on tools, but on behaviors. Like, we need to deploy frequently. We need to be able to deploy with a high degree of, confidence that the quality is good. Okay, we need to. And they said, okay, here's the behavior. Here's how we're going to kind of extend or make up our own tools by pairing with them on anything that got built, and then getting it deployed and getting it working. And they weren't done until the behavior changed, until they paired, and then that was done. Versus a lot of DevOps is I built this thing, and I'm like, no one cares. You need to treat DevOps as a product, and done is when users are using your product and loving it. So it's not hard to do, but it just takes. We had to treat that DevOps enablement team as a first class team, but also, by the way, I think most agile teams should be doing this too, spending less time in their team and more time going upstream and working with their customers. In this case, they're pairing with their customers and then bringing it back to the team and saying, this is what we did. So, I also talk a lot about this idea of doing a lot of upstream traveling. So however buried you are in the organization, you're in this, back office kind of, I don't know, component agile team or whatever, legacy developer agile team, whatever you want to call it, integration agile team. And okay, that's great. That's your org structure. Ignore that. Who's asking you for help? Go upstream, work with them, pair with them as closely as you can. You'll get to better outcomes. So.
And you touch on that when you talk about the idea of scaling both horizontally and vertically, which is the way you put that conceptually, it made me stop and go, that makes sense. Where we typically only view scaling as building the ecosystem, right? All the layers of abstraction and the layers of, let's be real here, the layers of bureaucracy. Whereas you talk about the concept of scaling horizontally, where that's connecting, your words were connecting upstream and downstream dependencies to cross boundaries and deliver work. It was coordinating the work within larger and larger organizational boundaries. And that to me was a big insight. That was a light bulb as well. It's when I try to say, well, we need cross-functional teams, that falls on deaf ears. But I say, look, we're trying to build an ecosystem that can deliver the value on its own.
That's right.
And not have to minimize the, autonomous, not independent. That to me was honestly, Jeff, it was a much easier sell with some of the people I was working with, because they were able to visualize it easier.
That's right. I mean, what's interesting is scaling horizontally is really an act of people engaging in acts of teamwork through the entire kind of value stream or value network, or call it whatever you want. And you can start anywhere. Like I was working for, I'm going to call them the Canadian credit card company, just because they were a little mercurial and letting me use their name. But I was working with the managing director of their branded cards, Brent Reynolds, amazing guy. I think I learned as much from him around organizing towards agility as I was brought in there to go help them to do. And what he started to do immediately is said, listen, I'm going to take all the aspects of my business, product, finance, security, all of them, and I'm going to start laying them out in this ecosystem type structure. He called them lanes. And he said, at first I'm going to try to put somebody in a team. And if that doesn't work because they're like in legal, and there's no way that this one team is going to need legal for like as a full-time member, I'm going to put them in what he called a lane. And he had one lane for like upsell customers, another lane for people that were like in recovery and remediation. And I can't remember what the third one was, like new products. And if I can't put them in the lane, then I'm going to put them in the line of business. And then if they belong in the outside enterprise, and I can't get them in my lane, I'll accept them there. But he had this very almost like I show this as an onion in the book, where you try to start at the team and get as that team to be as autonomous as you can. And if not, go one level up, not go one level up. And, if you do that and then put some a combination of visual management, cadences, various practices that you can, I call all the agile practices you know and love, or agile adjacent practices, and just apply them at a different scale. You can do an awful lot, and you'll never opened up any book on scaled agile frameworks. I'm not mentioning anyone in particular, but like any of the sort of, there's a lot of stuff around, oh, we need to scale agile with a 200-page, kind of like methodology. And I'm like, well, you
Playbook.
kind of, a playbook, you kind of don't. You kind of need to take what's working at the team level, don't apply it rote, understand why it's working. Oh, it's about flow, it's about teamwork, it's about small things, it's about working in pairs and threes and fours. Okay, how do I now start creating larger organizational contexts, and what cadence, what practice, what visualization can I apply there to get teamwork going at that level?
Jeff, what you were just describing, I think, is well summed up in one of the pull quotes that I put off to the side for myself to come back to when I need to, and that was, if I wrote it correctly, a secret that many don't see at first is that agile practices can and do scale. You just need to take the time to understand why they work and adapt them to the context of the larger scale. And what you just described to me is a brilliant example of that principle. And I just thought, like, that's kind of cutting through all the nonsense and getting to how to make this work at a larger scale. And I just thought that was great, along with the visionary pragmatism. I love that.
Yeah, that one I owe you royalties for that, because I've used that quite a bit. The idea
amazing.
That two-word combination really does describe what we're really shooting for in a very elegant way. And I mean, who doesn't want to be visionarily pragmatic, right? It's kind of like how the word agile sold so well. Who doesn't want to be agile?
Right. I mean, the visionary thing, like I've, especially coming from, my background is I came from a big consulting firm and was lucky enough to get the support to do the agile change thing before agile was like popular, and you could say agile outside of, a room in the back of the high school with the other developers, which I'm glad, I'm proud to say that those are my roots. So I that's my excuse for saying I probably did agile change the wrong way, and every wrong way you could possibly imagine. Big change, big roadmaps, huge visionary. Let's, throw the baby out with the bathwater. The problem with doing it in a visionary way is you're going to miss something if you try to figure that out up front, and you're going to miss big things. Like the devil is in the details, and the warts of the organization and the scarring that's there from the it's all about the past trauma and the past income and the past and the current constraints that really help you do this. So the pragmatism needs to be start small, do it incrementally, invite, don't inflict, be very willing to, be less like, do use cases if you want to. Oh, you love use cases? Here's a great, there's this guy named Alistair Coburn who does use cases in a cool way. So let's go do those. Or you don't want to do practice X, fine. You want to do mini waterfalls. That's another John Smart thing. Okay, mini waterfalls. We're going to do mini waterfalls. Be willing to move at the pace that the organization wants to, because success brings permission, and permission brings more success, and you can start building this out. So you have to really, and I'll admit, I'm not, it's easier to write about it and then sort of like kind of gloss over some of the mistakes I've made, but I struggle with the pragmatism part sometimes, but I've got lots of other people that help me and say, hey, Jeff, remember that pragmatic thing you talked about? I'm like, yeah, okay. So it's really important to kind of step up back and make it your clients, make it your customers. And that, by the way, if you're not a consultant, your client, and you're a coach full-time, then your customer is the teams. And if you're a scrum master, your customer is still the team. So you've always got customers, and make it really go at their pace. And then, because it's sort of like it goes like this. It stays shallow, and then all of a sudden it spikes up.
And the hard bit of that is the minute to minute, day to day judgment calls about when is it helpful to push a little bit versus pull back a little bit. And,
well, I'm a pusher. That didn't sound right. I like to push a lot.
But it's true though. It's almost like a bellows, right, Jeff? Like you have to lean in and push, and then you have to take a step back, and then you have to lean in again for maybe 5 degrees, 10 degrees off to the side. But that it's that constant. And I think there are people who misconstrue that. They would hear that and say, "Well, I need to push all the time, or I need to lead from my heels all the time." Whereas it really is, what's Ben's term of? It all comes down to
it's all about finding the right balance.
It's all about finding the right balance.
Yes.
And it really is. Like there are times where if you got a bit of a nibble on the line, pull the line as hard as you can. But there's other times where you have to let it go because you're right. Meet the organization at the rate of change that they're ready for, because otherwise you're gonna out another tired sports metaphor. You outkick your coverage and you find yourself out there standing there alone with a team bearing down your neck that wants to crush you into the AstroTurf.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And a conversation came up for me at work today was the idea of change fatigue. So if you push too hard, too long, you create fatigue or allergic reactions, to go back to, the biology thing, Jay.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't push enough, then they're not, the organization is not challenged, and it kind of gets stagnant. So it's a Goldilocks kind of problem. And you know what, we're human beings and we're dealing with other human beings. And sometimes we make good calls and sometimes we make not so good calls. And the thing that doing this for 15 plus years has taught me is to trust the team and get back up and do it again tomorrow. Because if you don't, what do you got?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, you kind of poked at this, Jeff, the idea of one of the biggest things we can do as change champions or forces of change or voices of change or coaches or transformation gurus or whatever is a little bit of humility.
Yeah.
Right? A little bit of humility, right? Like, yeah, maybe this isn't the time for me to lean in and beat this person over the head with it. I found some of the best results I've gotten is where I've said the thing so many times that someone will say in a meeting, "Oh, and here comes Jay talking about flow efficiency, and we got to stop keeping people busy." And I sit there and laugh because it's obviously gotten it through the first level, right? It's obviously sunk in enough that they can parrot it. So then that opens up. Now I don't have to repeat that line anymore. I can say, okay, so what are we doing about that? Now that you know the spiel that's going to come out of my mouth, you're just going to keep ignoring me. And it's a different conversation. It's a different conversation. Well, listen, we've gone on an hour and I want to be cognizant of everybody's time. So Jeff, if people want to find the book, they want to get in touch with you, they want to follow you and see what you're up to, where do they go? Where do they look?
There's a number of places. So first, book's out on Amazon. So go look for Organizing Towards Agility by Jeff Anderson. We can see Mike is holding that up. The second one is we just put up a new website called Agility with Jeff. And it's kind of what I tried to do is answer some, like we actually went and said, what are people asking about around Agile? Like, what are some of the most popular questions? And some of them are quite basic, like, which methodology is better, Agile or Waterfall, or what's the best one? And so what I tried to do is take some of those questions and say, okay, it's not about Waterfall versus Agile, it's about industrial versus human. And, just try to, or, reframe some of these things, like which one is the best Agile methodology? None of them, and just talk about the values and principles and the mindset and the practical things you can observe without getting into methodology wars. So, and then I'm slowly starting to scale up the content to incorporate some of the stuff in the book as well. So if people are actually, I think all of us as coaches are looking for new ways of just answering the mail with some of the basic questions. I'm trying to do it in a way that I hope is similar in the vein of what I've done within the book. And then finally, you can also just, I'm also the president and CEO of Agile by Design. And so if people want to go to agilebydesign.com, we've got a blog there that not only do I blog on, but a number of other coaches that work in our organization do as well.
Awesome. So I want to thank Jeff for coming on. I want to thank on behalf of Ben, Mike, and myself, on behalf of Ben, Mike, myself, and Jeff, I want to thank all of you for tuning in again. You know where to find us. You know to go to Discord. We've got royalty-free outro music. So until next time, we're saying cheers.
Bye, everyone.